Greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask a hell of a lot of questions. You can visit patreon.com/The Bitter Truth, and you can support the show and get some fabulous swag for your life. Also, if you would want to listen to the show for free, we're on all the usual suspects: YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. Go ahead and look up The Bitter Truth with Abe Abdelhadi, and you could subscribe there and get all the updates every time we put out a new show and go from there. So today, I'm excited. My guest is Kathy Swart. She is a librarian and humanities professor at Pierce College in Puyallup, Washington. And we got kind of put into each other's sphere because she's been going around the country doing a talk on based on librarians at the forefront of information justice. And there's been various titles of that talk, but basically she knows an awful lot about Brazil, and I'm sure it's going to leak into some other parts of South and Central America. But let's just get going. Kathy, are you there?
Yes.
How you doing?
Good morning. Oh, great.
Good.
Happy to be on the show. Happy
New Year, and I'm happy you're on the show too. So, so let's do this, because I think a lot of folks that pay attention to this kind of thing are familiar with Venezuela, or they're familiar with Bolivia, maybe to an extent Chile, maybe to an extent Argentina, but I don't know that anybody really knows about Brazil. So I was thinking maybe we could kind of start with the most recent, because most Americans kind of forget the last 20 minutes. If we can kind of talk a little bit about Bolsonaro and then work backwards to kind of when America started really interfering in Brazil's government. But let's just kind of jump in. I mean, I want to talk about Lula da Silva and all that kind of thing, but just kind of starting with the most recent. What's up with Jair Bolsonaro?
Well, he is someone who, I think one of the most disturbing things is that he praises the dictatorship that we're going to talk about later. He's said that he is okay with torture. He's even recently been making noises about longing to have another dictatorship. He said in the past that Pinochet didn't kill enough people in Chile.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And he thought, he has said in the past that the best thing for Brazil would just to kill 30,000 people outright. I mean, he's just very flamboyant. A lot of people call him the Trump of the tropics, and actually that is an insult to Trump, who I don't like, but he is far more dangerous than Trump.
Wow. That's saying something. And so real quick, to back up on kind of what you just said a second ago, and obviously I've never even seen that in alternative press, much less the mainstream. But so he's called for the execution of 30,000 people for. Was there a reason, or he just thought it would make Brazil better? What's his?
Quotes are from the past. He was a captain in the army, I believe, at the end of the dictatorship. He was younger then. Okay. But he's just very brazen about his disgust for, I guess, democratic values.
Okay.
Yeah. He is happily handing over a lot of resources, privatizing everything in sight. And saluting Trump really offended a lot of people. He actually saluted Trump one day. And the thing is that what's so disturbing is that if Lula had been allowed to run, he would have won.
Sure.
And that's why he was imprisoned on very trumped up charges.
I was in the impression he ran from prison. He did not, correct?
No, he didn't.
Okay.
He wasn't allowed.
And so what were some of these charges? Because I remember when he went in, it looked real fishy, and then they replaced him with somebody else, correct? As an interim?
You mean someone to run for him for the Workers' Party?
Yeah.
Fernando Haddad, yes. And he's a nice, professor type person, but, personality and charisma mean a lot in history in Brazil, and he just didn't have the time to, gain enough of a following. Mm-hmm. But there was also a WhatsApp campaign, and I believe it's associated with Cambridge Analytica, that ridiculous messages going out on WhatsApp, which most Brazilians use as their main social media, saying that Adad would force their kids to go to kindergarten and they would receive a kit teaching them how to be gay in kindergarten. He
Wow.
was accused of, this is all, talk about fake news, okay? This is extreme. There were pictures of little baby bottles with penises on the tips. And this was, voters were told, this is what Adad is all about, is turning your kids gay. And unfortunately, these messages, I'm afraid there's not a lot of critical information literacy.
Well, I mean,
in Brazil.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, what did, besides accusing the opposition of wanting to turn the kids gay, what was Bolsonaro's main platform? Because De Silva was loved, right? I mean, he was. I mean, not everybody, obviously, but he was a very popular president before he went into jail, right?
Yes.
So what was De Silva? So what was Bolsonaro's pitch besides your kids are going to be turned into gay people? I mean, what did he do to get people excited about him?
It's really hard to say. There's not much of a platform. There wasn't much of a platform. He just seemed to be against the Workers' Party, against Lula. All those leftists are communists. He was repeating slogans from the Cold War, which is so ridiculous today. And yet people fell for them. I mean, I have a Brazilian friend who, his dad, even today, says, "Oh, you want to play reggae music? You're a communist. Don't go into the liberal arts. That's communism." Unfortunately, the dictatorship, I think 21 years of right-wing dictatorship leaves its mark, and you end up having a very conservative society. The truth wasn't really told about all that happened during those years, and the lies still proliferate. And that this is my concern as a librarian, as an information scientist. Why are these lies being repeated, even in the U.S.? When the facts actually are documented out there to the contrary.
Right,
so
right.
This is really the nature of my work.
Well, isn't that sort of the human nature, though, right? I mean, like you bring up something that flies in the face of someone's, paradigm or whatever, they get a little pissy. If you tell them that the guy we just killed in Iran, for example, was there on a diplomatic mission, so it looked like it might have been a setup to assassinate him, people who want to believe that Iran is the boogeyman get very, very upset, and they call you a traitor, they call you a Putin puppet, they call you an apologist for Trump, they call you all kinds of things, and I hate Trump. So I wouldn't be defending him. I thought the impeachment hearing was bullshit, but that's not because I like him. It's because, it was bullshit. But but people like to be attached to those things, and I run into it very seldom. I don't know if you do because you work at a school and you're smarty pants, but I run into it very seldom that people are open to a new set of information. And I'm a pretty snarky person, but when I discuss some of these things with people, I work to be as reasonable as possible, to sound reasonable, and I employ all the little sales tactics to kind of make it go down better, and they lose their shit. They still lose their shit. So, that's I think that's a simple answer to that question, right? I mean, because if 21 years, and I want to get in that a second because I didn't know that they were a dictatorship before De Silva, but in 21 years of a right wing dictatorship, you're going to have a lot of leftover, like you said, a lot of leftover marks, right?
Right, and unlike Chile and Argentina that set up truth commissions fairly soon, Argentina quicker than Chile, there was not a truth commission for, I think, 40 years.
Wow.
And by that time, people are indoctrinated, and it really came down to the amnesty law. We can talk about that later, but the thing about talking about Brazil and teaching about it that's helpful is that unlike when you're talking about Putin and Trump and all in the Middle East, people come to the topic of Latin America without a lot of baggage because they actually have no knowledge. And my students admit it to me all the time. They said, I'm just so glad I took this course because no one in any class in my entire educational career has ever mentioned these countries.
Right.
And I didn't know any of this, and I'm so glad I know it now. Latin America, and especially Brazil, is largely ignored, I feel. And Brazil being the fifth largest country in the world, it's really bizarre. Mm-hmm. Like, most people couldn't find it on a map.
Well, if you can't find Brazil on a map, this is going to sound very dictator-like, but you need to be taken out and shot if you can't find Brazil on a map. Like, that should be the euthanizing mark. You know, we should have euthanasia. But how would we measure it? They can't find Brazil on a map. Right in the back. Sorry, I'm sure you're a great parent, but no, you can't raise kids. And I'm kidding. It's a joke, just in case I get cards and letters. But no, but seriously though, it's like, but I think to your point, and this is just speculation. I don't do what you do, but could it be that because of the Monroe Doctrine, that the attitude of not only Americans but the American media towards Central and South America is like it's our backyard. We can kind of do whatever the fuck we want, so it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? It's like no, go ahead.
I would say that's been the government's attitude, and the media tends to follow the government. And this is what's really shocking when you look at, when you look at reports, the media reports about the coup. Most mainstream papers and magazines were in favor of it. And most of the people they interviewed were generals or State Department officials. And what are they going to say? Mm-hmm. They're going to give it was necessary. It was actually a democratic move to prevent communism. I don't know how they spun dictatorship into democracy, but it's that upside down.
Well, it's what we tell the people, right? I mean, like the other day on Facebook, a good friend of mine I've known like 10, 12 years, and I was kind of riffing on Iran, and he's like, well, what do you want to do? Just have terrorists run rampant? I'm like, okay, well, first of all, if you can show me where Iran is, quote, being terrorists, if you're supporting Hezbollah or Hamas, legally, international law, those guys have a right to resist occupation. And if it wasn't for Hezbollah, Lebanon would have been annexed by the Israelis by now. That's first of all. Second of all, who is the bigger terrorist? We support 73% of the world's dictators. We're occupying 149 countries. Nobody invited us. We're still in Japan and Okinawa. After World War II, they hate us there. Rape convictions and everything else. We're horrible there. And so, but when it comes to Central and South America, I mean, people just, I think they kind of just tune out. They act like it's our backyard and we can kind of do what we want. I remember back in the 80s, with El Salvador, and I don't want to jump around too much, but like in El Salvador, for example, they killed like 7 nuns. They raped and killed like 7 or 8 nuns and a very popular bishop, right? And that was just completely swept under the rug. I had to get that out of the LA Reader. Meanwhile, some priest gets killed in Poland. It's all over the world news because the communists did it. The evil commies did it, right? But when it's a client state of the United States, right in our own backyard in El Salvador, we're not going to hear about it.
That's exactly true. I mean, I find this. I mean, you see remnants of it today, even in our encyclopedias. They just omit the U.S. role in these countries, and they actually outright lie at other times. And I'm very concerned about this because imagine if people had really been informed about what was going on in Brazil in the 60s and 70s, would we have had the 1973 coup in Chile? Which I don't like to get into comparing dictatorships, but it was so vicious.
Oh, 100%. And Kissinger orchestrated that whole thing.
Yeah. Oh, and he was okay with Brazil, too.
Absolutely. This is the challenge. This is the ugly truth that people don't like to admit at cocktail parties. We're inherently a racist country. And by that, I don't mean that everybody in this country is like cool with, killing people that are brown or black. But when it happens, our attitude is kind of like, oh, well, we shrug our shoulders. Pulling a coup in Bolivia, and the only excuse the mainstream press could come up with was, well, he was there for 14 years, and the Supreme, even though he took his case to the Supreme Court to run again, and he won, and then he won by 10 points, They come back with the OAS saying, well, the elections didn't look honest. Okay. Since when is that our business? Number one. Number two, if people ran too long, well, Angela Merkel has been running Germany for 15 years. Are we going to pull a coup in Germany?
My friend made that statement, and no one had a problem with that.
No one had a problem with that, right? And so talk about Allende in '73. I mean, I don't want to get too into that because that's a big topic on itself. But so okay. So back up into Lula da Silva's time as president. When did he win election?
I believe it was 2003 is when he took office.
Now that was 21, and you're saying that's 21 years after the dictatorship was over, or that's after the?
No, it's only the dictatorship was from 64 to 85.
Okay, so after João Goulart in '64, that's when the dictatorship.
Yes.
Okay.
Now they had a very rocky transition to democracy. So Lula was one of the first presidents he was the only president from the left to have been elected since Goulart. Mm-hmm. And he did amazing things for the country. So did Dilma Rousseff, who followed him in the same party. It's not that they were perfect. They conciliated a lot, probably because they had to, people say, to maintain, to stay in office. But they raised millions of people out of poverty. Mm-hmm. And people don't realize, too, that Brazil had one of the most unequal wealth distributions in the world.
Right.
There was definitely a very small elite upper class, a very pretty small middle class, and then many, many impoverished people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so they were trying to do something about this. So was Goulart. And this is, part of the reason he was overthrown. It's that whole, was it El Salvador was founded by 14 families?
The junta, yep.
Yeah, when you look at the history of how the different countries in Latin America were settled, you had, a few people owning everything. And then you had the slave, in Brazil's case, lots of slaves, and then the indigenous people who were, a lot of them were wiped out. And so you had just a very hierarchical and very unequal system, and that just persisted through the centuries. Mm-hmm. So it was very difficult to, different presidents have tried flattening out, this, but that was equated with communism. This is the big problem, too, is that the United States, especially through the CIA, really whipped up this fervor against communism. And anyone who even opposed the regime would be called a communist. I feel like I'm going too far back to Brazil.
No. Well, we started off from Brazil, and I want you to. People don't talk about this. I want you to say this.
I want to tell you a story. This is insane. Okay, in the early '60s, the CIA. This is documented by an actual ex-CIA operative, and he wrote the only true encyclopedia. Article, a long one, about what happened in Brazil, David McMichael. And he talked about how the CIA paid people to dress up as northeastern peasants, proclaim themselves to be communists, and set fire to buildings so that they could create the illusion of a communist threat in order to justify the U.S. Supporting the coup.
Well, yeah, it's like the brown shirts in the Weimar Republic. It's the exact same thing. You burn down the parliament and you say we have an emergency.
Yeah, it was just very tragic too, because the victims, the number tortured from this regime is now estimated at 20,000, 50,000 imprisoned, about 8,800 killed. If you take into account the indigenous people, which official reports generally leave them out because, they weren't considered real victims, right? Mm-hmm. Exiled 10,000%. It was a horrible time. Even if you could avoid the becoming a victim of the regime, life was not pleasant. It was very, you get these impressions from books like The Celebration by Ivan Angelo. It was stultifying. And in fact, there's a word for these years called the years of lead.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, but when Joan Goulart got overthrown, it wasn't it wasn't Allende. It wasn't like an assassination like Torrijos in Panama. It was just, he left, right? I mean, they didn't.
Well, they drove him out. Yeah. Some of the misinformation I read, like, Goulart fled. Well, of course he fled because he knew the army was coming for him.
Right.
And I mean, more recently, I've heard that they actually found that he was killed. Later, several years later. It was always considered an accident, and now they discovered he was killed. But yeah, it was not as dramatic as Allende. He wasn't as dramatic as a person. He was actually stood for mildly progressive reforms. He was not a communist. He wanted to remain neutral in the Cold War, and I guess the United States just couldn't have this. But I think that my opinion, after doing lots of reading, is that his wanting to nationalize Brazil's resources, especially iron, was the most, I mean, that was the most disturbing to the U.S. And also, the U.S. had a lot of investment in Brazil. And so the president starts talking about nationalizing this and that, and maybe a little land reform, because there were so many landless people that irks the upper class, the elites, the landholders. A few percent own, most of everything.
But see But you said something a second ago. That's the MO of the United States. It was the MO of most of the European countries, the Belgians, the Brits, the French. They used to do the same thing when they were colonizing and creating empire. Then that all fell away, and we took over pretty much after World War II. And we began our own empire. We really started building it with the Spanish-American War. That's why we had the war, because nobody had a stomach for it. So we made up the whole thing about the USS Maine. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And but to stay to my point, the more dramatic illustration of this is like Guatemala or Chile. In Guatemala, he had Arbenz in there, and he was fucking with United Fruit. He'd raised the minimum wage. He's nationalizing all the bananas and pineapples and everything. And so John Foster Dulles goes to his brother Alan, who just so happened to be running the CIA. We got a problem down here. And so they had a coup. And they overthrew the guy and put in a fucking puppet government that Richard Nixon, when he was VP, went down there. And if you look at the YouTube clip, it's hilarious. He's like, for the people to finally forge a course of their own. And I'm like, dude, shut the fuck up. We take people's shit, and then we make them work for 15 cents a day, no bathroom breaks, and we wonder why nobody likes us.
Oh, God, yeah. And the lies. I mean, Arben's a communist.
Yeah.
If they're against the U.S., you're automatically a communist. And like with the coup in Brazil, I have this in front of me, this Reader's Digest from '64, called a special little pamphlet that you can mail to your friends called The Country That Saved Itself. And it is written by Clarence W. Hall, a noted, kind of freakish anti-communist. And he talks about the inspiring story of how an aroused Brazilian people stopped communists from taking over the nation.
Right.
I mean, actually, the pamphlet is just a bunch of lies.
Sure,
okay?
Sure.
And what happened on the day of the coup was that the tanks rolled down empty streets. There was no communist stockpile of weapons. There was no communist resistance. It was all based on lies. And while there was a communist party, it was not a party that was revolutionary. Later, when the dictatorship started just hunting down anyone on the left, some revolutionary groups arose. And a few of them took up arms, but, it was, the whole thing was portrayed as some noble prevention of a communist takeover, when it was actually just a military takeover supported by the United States.
Yeah.
And then they were supposed to stay in power only a year, right? And then turn it over to democracy again. They stayed 21 years.
Well, this is the bullshit when people are talking about elections this year in Bolivia. I'm like, you fucking kidding? I saw this kid interviewed who's trying to run for, in Evo Morales' party. Like he seems sincere. He's like 30, and he's energetic, and they're going to kill him. They're going to kill him, or the election's going to be fixed. I mean, it's. You said a second ago that it's just that pamphlet was all lies. Right before Christmas, there's this bar I go to by my house, and a few nights a week, and there's a new couple that I had not met, but my friends knew, and we're all chatting. It was like Christmas Eve, and I was going to go to Christmas Eve dinner somewhere else. And so we're chatting. She's Mexican, he's Nicaraguan, and we talked about Cuba. Because I went there like 7 years ago. And I went to Cuba, and then Nicaragua came up. And he fled Nicaragua in the 80s. So he's about my age. So he was probably 14, 15 years old. I'm older than him, I think. And so he was telling me, about, Ortega and everything else. And he goes, well, they say they have elections. I'm like, well, hang on. They do have elections. Ortega won the last 2 elections, 3 rather. But he wasn't president for like 12 years. Bolanos was president for 15 years because they have 5-year terms. And that guy won a re-election 3 times. And before that, it was Ortega for a term, and before that, it was somebody else. And Ortega had 2 terms in the 80s. I mean, so they have been having elections versus the Somoza family, who won a quote-unquote election in 1937, right? And then they never had another election after we put them in 1937. And they ran the country till 1979 with somebody named Somoza. It was an uncle or a cousin or a son or a nephew. Somebody named Somoza was running the fucking country for 33 years. Right, and so you're like, gee, 43 years, and you're going, well, gee whiz, who is more on? So what? And so I asked this guy, I go, so do you have a stake in the country if it reverts back to a Somoza style regime? He goes, no. Well, my uncle lost a lot of property when I was a kid, but I'm not close to him. I'm thinking, yeah, but you know what? Though the money's there. And so when I meet Latino people, when I meet people that are Hispanic, when I meet people from like Nicaragua or Guatemala or anywhere, as soon as they start pitching the CIA narrative, I start digging a little bit. Because I know. And my biggest lesson slap in the face, I was about 22, 23 years old, I was working at a record company and ended up becoming very good friends with this person. He passed away a few years back. But when we were kids, we're both interning at this record company, going to college, and he was from El Salvador. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, hey, fuck the junta. No. His old man was a lawyer. Yeah, that was wrong audience. His old man was an attorney for Exxon. And and had worked with ambassadors and did all that shit, and he came from a lot of money, and he was telling me that I didn't know how dare I because you don't know what it's like being terrorized by rebels who want to kill you. And I said, well, I guess I also don't know what it's like to be part of 1,000 people a month that are dying down there to justify you guys having a KFC in San Salvador. I mean, this what sucked about the first year we knew each other is about every 2 weeks we'd go get lunch with a couple of people. They're about our age, 22, 23 years old. They're just trying to figure shit out, right? Whatever. And as soon as the news came up, this one girl would just roll her eyes. Oh, here we go. And it was just like, it was me and him. and that was my first lesson of like, hey, man, just because they came here doesn't mean that they're fleeing. A lot of these folks aren't fleeing. I've met people from Honduras over the last 7-8 years that aren't fleeing. They're cool that we arrested Zelaya. He was raising the minimum wage. He was fucking with their deal, right?
That's the thing, and those are the kind of people who have the money to come here.
Right.
Right? And I used to be naive about that too, and I assume anyone from Brazil, that's sort of in the past, but El Salvador, people from El Salvador, a student in the library once said, yeah, I'm so proud my dad fought in that war. And it became evident that, he was on the U.S. backed.
Yeah, he probably right? shot a nun, is what he probably killed a nun.
Yeah, and I'm like,
super duper.
This keep it in. And one of my students this last year, she was telling me that her mother was from El Salvador and had told her about all those terrorists, and so it became clear that she had been given this picture of left-wing terrorists, communists, make life miserable for all of us. And through my course, where we actually look at the arts of various Latin American countries, and many of them are songs of resistance, and we look at context. I gave her an article about what really happened there, and I just saw her face falling. Every week through the quarter, her face would get more and more. She was realizing that, she had gotten one side of the picture, and it seemed devastating to her. And then at the end, she just came up and said, "Thank you so much for this course," because it showed the pattern.
But see, but that's kudos to her, though, because I know people and have talked to people where you bring that up and they go, "Well, fuck it, it's America anyway." I had a friend of mine 3 weeks ago, a real human being, not Facebook, a guy that I know, good guy. And he's kind of a Clinton blue type person, kind of a corporate guy, but he's not some Mitch McConnell Nazi dude, right? And so we got in this huge argument about Russia, because Russia's gotten made into the boogeyman again. And I was just sort of going, it amazes me that you guys keep bitching about Russia. We got 50% of American workers making under $30,000 a year right now. That ain't Russia's fault, right? We got 500,000 bankruptcies last year because of medical reasons, and they had coverage. That's not Russia's fault. So why don't you go after Israel and Saudi Arabia, because they're costing us more money than the fucking Russians, okay? Because they keep us in the Middle East to cover their ass, and that's costing us like $1.2 trillion this coming budget. And then he got into this thing, and he goes, well, do you support Russia? And I go, I support the idea of making peace with your enemies and deals with your friends. And U.S. hegemony has not been good for people. It's been bloody for at least 100 years. He goes, well, I'd rather have our hegemony than Russian hegemony.
Oh, my gosh.
And I was like, you know what? Okay, I've known you about 3 years. Every time this shit comes up, you and I agree to a point, and then it goes right to blows. Now I know never to talk about this shit with you anymore, because we're at a philosophical impasse. We just are, we don't agree on that. Hegemony is when I hit you in the face, surprised that you did not pay me for it, and even more shocked that you hit me back. We're surprised that the Iranians are pissed at us? That is the ultimate John Wayne fucking fantasy, that we could just do whatever the fuck we want to do and think people aren't going to be just a little bit pissed off.
I don't get it. But I have to say, I've been so impressed with a lot of my students, some that even, they tell me in the beginning, I'm very Republican, I'm part of the military, I'm blah, blah, blah. And I expect all this, pushback about learning this history. And for the most part, they just accept it and say, thank you, I didn't know this.
See, but you're also not making fun of their family for being in the military. I think the kids volunteering for the armed services are awesome. They're brave. It's our dickheaded government that sends them into harm's way for any willy-nilly thing to make a buck.
Right, and they're not told that. Of course, they don't know that when they go in.
No.
A lot of them are going in to get their college educations paid. I mean, I've lost some students, I saw them on a certain path, and then they came to me and say, well, the Marines are recruiting me because I'm a good swimmer, and my heart breaks. Because, well, how else am I going to pay for college? And it's just awful. But what I wish is that the history of what the U.S. has done abroad, and not just Latin America, but they had a lot of Latin America, but around the world, if this was taught in textbooks, wouldn't we vote differently? Wouldn't we elect different leaders?
100%.
There's just a thought from Michael Weiss did an analysis of how newspapers and magazines responded to the coup, and he's the one that came up with that statistic where most supported the coup, and he said, and because they just interviewed generals and didn't interview any of the victims on the left or the exiles, it was just accepted and filed away, and no one paid attention to it anymore. And he's like, would we have gone to Vietnam if all this had come out in the open?
Right,
and Chile, Uruguay, and the rest. So I guess that's what makes me keep teaching this and telling students, don't fall for just reductive narratives like an encyclopedia about some history of some other country.
100%. Well, so let me ask you. So kind of back to Brazil real quick. So so President Goulart, he's out 64 to 85. We've got a full-on dictatorship. What happened with that dictatorship? How did that end? Coming into a more democratic system.
Okay, well, the torture was started even in '64, even though that's not widely known. It was kept secret. But in '68, well, there were several dictators too, because they kept dying, and then they just put someone else in.
Funny.
But in 1968 came Institutional Act Number 5, and this is what allowed the police and the military to declare open season on anyone even suspected of being left. The reason they had it is that the students were in the street saying, "Hey, this coup was supposed to bring a military government for 1 year. You've been here 4 years. People are disappearing. You're repressing. You're censoring." I mean, it was sort of a soft dictatorship the first 4 years, but by '68, there was a lot of protest against it, and so they declared AI5 to crush any resistance. And this is when the bulk of the worst, the torture really happened. And they just wiped out brutally, with the United States' help, by the way. They wiped out thousands of, anyone even opposed, even considered, suspected of being against regime. And I have to say, this included children. They actually tortured children in front of their parents. I mean, it was just, and when you read about it, it's horrifying. Like, these things they did to people haven't been heard of since the Inquisition, I think. It was I mean, it was just not like, oh, let's pour some water on his face, and like the images. When we think of torture, we think of some bad things we saw in Iraq, but these were like really, really awful. And so this was in '68. Things got really bad. They wiped out any kind of left movement. Then in '85, there was a very beloved journalist called Vladimir Herzog, and he was, accused of being leftist or whatever, and the police ordered him to come in. And that very day, they claimed that he had hung himself in his cell. And it was very clear that he'd been tortured to death.
Right.
And they showed this fake picture of him hanging with his feet on the ground. I mean, hanging? Seriously, he hung himself with a piece of cloth, and his feet were touching the ground. I mean, it was so obvious that this actually brought a lot of people out in the streets. And, it was rocky, but eventually it led to what they called the opening up, where they started making noises about less repression and moving toward elections. But it took several more years before they really got there.
Wow.
And then this is why no one knows anything about this. The amnesty law of 1979. A lot of people had exiled themselves or been kicked out of Brazil, tortured, and left England, U.S., all around the world. And people, of course, their families wanted them to come home. So the amnesty law said, yes, you can come home, and we won't prosecute you. we won't punish you for having been our victim, right?
Right.
It's just ridiculous thought. But your coming home is contingent upon no one in the military being prosecuted for their human rights violations.
And that's the amnesty law?
Yeah.
That sounds like a shitty law.
I mean, it's ridiculous. So you can come home, but we're not going to go after the guy who almost killed you, tortured your sister to death, or your child. These people got off scot-free, unlike in Chile and Argentina, where there was some attempt to bring people to justice. No one, as far as I know, not one person tortured from the Brazilian regime has been brought to justice. And a lot of it is because of the amnesty law. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has actually declared the amnesty law illegal.
Yeah, but we don't.
Said no.
And the older I get, I heard an expression the other day. The law is kind of like cobwebs. It's good enough to catch the weak, but the strong just bowl right through it.
Yeah,
and it's kind of what we do.
I mean, Brazil has been able to totally ignore that.
Right.
That finding that the amnesty law is, And, and then years pass, people don't care, but this all came up again when Dilma Rousseff became president, because it came out that she had been one of these members of a group, revolutionary group, and she had been tortured horribly. And it was something she didn't talk about much. She didn't want necessarily slung around, but people knew. And it was actually because a few papers like The Guardian mentioned Dilma's history that's how I even discovered a lot of this, because they had just been buried. And so some people hated her automatically because she had been against the dictatorship. But she was the one who, Lula started something, but Dilma Rousseff really started the Truth Commission. But they were given very little money and only 2 years. And so, in the final report, there's probably millions of pages of reports, but then they didn't really do anything with it, and still no one is prosecuted.
So let me ask you, though, so parallel to this, because the OAS, the Organization of American States, started in about, I think, 1955, 6? And they, far as I understand, they have never, ever gone against one single thing that the United States wants, ever. Yeah. So parallel to this time, the OAS is operating and is around, and, so where were they on any of these atrocities happening in Brazil? Did they report on it? Did they say, or did they just say, "Oh yeah, no, it's all good. They got a great thriving government there"? What did they have to say about that?
I have to say I don't know, because in all my reading, I don't recall the OAS having a voice.
Which makes sense.
Being mentioned.
Well, it makes sense because their function is to pretty much rubber stamp whatever immediate decision they need, like with Bolivia. Oh, the elections were rigged. Do you have any proof of that? Well, no, but they were. Oh, okay. Almost every, human rights group was in Bolivia during the elections, and they all said the same thing, that it was a fair election, and it was paper ballots. It wasn't the shit we do here,
My friends from Brazil and other countries where they've experienced these things say the OAS is just a tool.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
They're never going to really care about human rights violations.
Oh, listen, look. I mean, when Ecuador went down, when Rafael Correa split and Lena Moreno got put in there, they didn't say shit about him selling out Assange and violating a shit ton of really good laws involving embassies and, sovereignty. Just sent the British police in there to arrest a guy whose citizenship you revoked. Good times, right? And this is the sort of 8th grade corruption that we wonder why we got kids, probably misbehaving more. They see adults getting away with fucking murder. Back in the day, when you're 12, 11 years old, 9, you don't understand Watergate. You just know that somebody did something wrong and he had a split. Later you kind of find out some of the more details, but when you're 11, you're going, shit, they even got the president. Oh, you better watch your ass. Now it's like, nobody cares. Nobody cares. They steal in broad daylight. They don't fucking care.
It's almost like it's going back from...
Pardon?
These coups since 2002 or so have been like parliamentary coups. Not with tanks, but through, wrangling in there and just saying pretty much we're going to tell you who your next president is going to be.
Yeah.
This is often through what's called lawfare. Have you heard of the Department of Justice program, Lava Jato, car wash?
Nope.
Oh, this is a joint Department of Justice program where they trained a bunch of people from Latin America in certain prosecution methods. This is how they were able to put Lula away, and so that he couldn't run for president. And they're like, depends on really thin plea bargaining, people being promised something if they will say that Lula did this or that. I mean, it's really a joke. But it's the way that they have gone after the pink tide, right? I mean, so this evil Michelle Bachelet in Chile, Kirchner in Argentina, they have just, each one of them has had to fight off this Lava Jato program. It even is implicated in the coup against Dilma Rousseff. And she wasn't even corrupt. I mean, she wasn't even... even today they're admitting, well, she wasn't corrupt, and even what she did with the fiscal balancing the budget, that's how we all balance the budget. It was declared legal 2 days after she left office. I mean, it's just a really insidious way of asserting U.S. control, I feel, over all these countries.
Well, yeah, and that's but it's for the resources and nothing else. I mean, they were going on about Bolivia and Venezuela, and I'm like, okay, even with all the sanctions that Obama had left them with, and that Trump imposed like 45 more, and stealing Citgo oil and doing all that crap to them, they still had like a 5% poverty rate. Okay, and they actually had people that weren't homeless because they actually provided housing for workers, and were they millionaires? No, but they were making a living wage. They had some decency in their lives. They had a clean place to live. Yet, meanwhile, next door in Colombia, the capitalist Colombia, they got a 30% poverty rate. They kill campesinos by the thousands. They rig elections and they murder journalists on the regular. But they give us all their shit for free, and their people work for no money and no bathroom breaks. We get the free bananas, cocaine, and coffee. And so they're cool. As long as they say they're the protests in Chile, that wasn't covered in the media. Saw Hong Kong up the ass. Right?
Oh, gosh.
This is how it's CIA-tested, mother-approved protests. What did they do with Occupy? They cracked their skulls. What did they do at DAPL? Hose them down in 30 below weather with water hoses and crack their skulls. What happened when the little 16-year-old climate person was running around? Everybody had a march for a day. Kid-sanctioned, mother-approved, right? Chile, did you hear about it? Lebanon, did you hear about it? Iraq, did you hear about it? France has been going on for a year and a half. You never see it in the American media. Ever, ever, ever. I got to look at Al Jazeera. I got to look at The Intercept. You're never going to see that that they're actually getting their demands. They're like halfway down the list. Macron's freaking out because he gave his rich buddies a big tax break, kind of like Trump did. But then he goes to the people. Well, we're gonna have to privatize the ports and the airports, and we're gonna have to charge tax on your retirement, and we're gonna have to charge for college, and we're gonna have to charge for Medicare. And the last straw. This is what started the whole thing. They put $1 a gallon, literally, like 30 cents a liter, like $1.20 a gallon gas tax on top of everything else. So it's austerity and capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. And they lost their shit. And they said, fuck you. And they had been protesting every weekend. 500,000 French people every weekend. Different ones, I'm sure, in 2,000 cities, right? If America did that in 12 cities, people would lose their fucking mind. And I don't mean just one day. Get out there every fucking weekend and do it. You'll never see that here. You'll never see that in the American media. We lost the urge and the will withal to protest. We just don't do it anymore. We used to. We used to be really good at it too. And we stopped.
I wonder what happened.
What happened was the brass got smart, right? I was talking to my brother about this before our show today, because he's about my age, and I'm older than him by 6 years, which is almost a generation. Because Vietnam ended when I was 12, right? So I remember from kindergarten, first grade, as long as I could remember, my dad was a news junkie. News was on all the time. What was on all the time? Every single night. Vietnam, 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 Vietnam. Every night, every night, every night. How many killed? Dan Rather's in front of some hospital that got bombed out. They're pulling out bodies behind him. That's the background, And he's standing there. This is Dan Rather. I'm in da-dum-dum, Vietnam. Whatever. And he's, or Morley Safer, one of those guys. It was always some dude in camo hanging out with the army. Or talking to the North Vietnamese. It was always something. The brass got smart and realized if we sanitize it and we clean it up, people don't get mad. They don't get mad. They don't go out in the street. And Nixon got rid of the draft, not because he's the, fatherly old nice guy. Nixon got rid of the draft to get rid of the pressure from the middle class. Because it was the middle classes and the upper middle class kids who were not going to college who were getting drafted.
Right.
And that's who was protesting. You had plenty of black folks and brown folks doing the civil rights thing, and some of them were protesting in Vietnam, but protesting went down dramatically after the draft went away. And you move into the 70s and 80s, and what do? Grenada, bullshit. That we didn't even show it. We just talked about it. Panama, another bullshit war, country of 2 million people, size of goddamn Austin. And we invade with our mighty army, and we kill 6,000 people, and we take out the president that we installed. Right? Yeah. And Noriega was our guy. We replaced Torrijos with him because Torrijos wouldn't play ball. And Noriega played ball. It was the same thing with Chile and Allende, right? Anaconda Copper Wouldn't get in their way, sort of like United Fruit in Guatemala in 54. Excuse me?
ITT.
Right.
ITT was a big funder of not only Chile's coup, but Brazil's.
Wait, say that last part again?
ITT had a lot to do with Allende's overthrow.
Oh, 100%. Them and Anaconda Copper.
Yeah, several copper companies.
Yeah, but largely...
Because Allende wanted to nationalize copper.
Right, and that's the thing. You don't need... Here's the thing with quote, conspiracies. You don't need a bunch of guys in a smoke-filled room. You only need one or two. And if Anaconda Copper is acting in the best interest of their peer group, other American copper companies, and they can afford to do it, which they could, then the other copper companies are like, yeah, that's cool. And they have no opinion. You know, and then meanwhile you got Allende shooting himself on Chilean radio from the presidential palace, giving his last speech, and Kissinger orchestrated that whole thing. We just don't want people taking agency in their lives. We did the same thing in Iran in '53. We just don't nationalize your resources, give people a living wage and a quality of life. Fuck you. That's less money for us. It's not that people necessarily hate these people or want to harm them. They're just like, well, we're sorry, but you're cutting into our profit. Can't you just make enough profit and have everybody just sort of get along and everyone makes money?
Or just pay Chile a fair wage for their copper and Brazil for their iron.
Yeah, but see, you can't. But to do that means Chile owns the copper, and we can't have that.
Right.
That extra 10 cents a pound. Anaconda is willing to kill people to save that extra 10 cents a pound, whatever it is. United Fruit is ready to kill people over 5 cents an extra pound for bananas. That's American capitalism. That's capitalism. And it's capitalism. It's just by design. It's not like the boogeyman capitalism. You know what I mean?
It's just how it works.
It's just how it works.
You don't learn in school about the capitalism that means, we have to go to other foreign countries and install dictators there so that we can keep getting their stuff.
Right.
Do we learn this? No.
And those people, if you ever listen to them talk, and only in the last few years since Trump's been president have we stopped using the soft language, but we used to use the soft language all the time. And then Bolton flat out said, yeah, well, as soon as we get in there with Venezuela and we start, processing that oil, American companies get in there, it's going to be good for everybody. I'm like, oh, that's flat out saying you're going to steal their oil, which we did. No one batted an eye.
No one seems to care very much.
Excuse me?
And no one seems to care very much.
Right.
Because Maduro's a dictator.
Right.
Chavez is a dictator.
And
it's funny how certain people are, if they're friendly, like Pinochet was authoritarian, but Maduro's a dictator.
See,
there's a very, subversive language to, you see it in the information, how it's to twist.
Well, it's frustrating. It's frustrating if you know half of anything. When people say that, I'm going, well, we support 73% of the world's dictators. How come we're not taking them out?
Right. And I think, is it just ignorance, just plain old ignorance? I suspect it is because, when you show people, and I get students from all walks of life, different ages in my class, and they're horrified.
Sure.
And they don't want this to happen, and they're ashamed that this, the country, our government has done this, and they have very human reactions. Maybe it's a victim of one of these regimes.
Hey, wait, say that last part. I'm sorry, say that last part. You broke up. Say that last part again. Victim of these, and then you went away. With
the arts, with music, with artists, poetry, the actual personal stories of people who were victims of these regimes really touch students' hearts and make them ask really strong questions. Why? Why did the U.S. support this? I actually have people, I have someone from Brazil and someone from Chile come to my class, and they relate their experiences. And this makes a huge impact on people.
Sure.
And I think that's what we need to do is take it out of the abstract realm of U.S. foreign policy, making sure the rest of the world is democratic and we get their stuff. You have to actually hear from the people whose lives are affected forever by these actions.
Well, yeah, and not somebody lying about their experience. Like I'm not saying the Nicaraguan guy was lying, but he's full of shit when he's trying to like spin it to my friends. Oh yeah, well they haven't had elections since Somoza, but bullshit, they haven't. Yes, they have. He was like going on about Ortega, and that's the only name everybody really knows is Daniel Ortega. And I'm going, whoa. That guy was only been president for 3 terms this last time. The Bolanos guy was president before him for a couple of 3 terms. And they had another cat in the 90s, and then Ortega. So what are you talking about? They've had elections, and he got real quiet. Right, because he was like, you didn't want to argue with me on Christmas Eve, and I was kind of getting hot. And then his wife started cracking up because we were talking about Cuba, so she knows her and I were talking about Cuba while he was kind of sidetracked, and then he joined the conversation. And then that's where he kind of like, oh shit, this guy, yeah, don't give me this shit about I love America. I love America too. The government's not America. I love our people. I love the culture. I love rock and roll. I love blue jeans. I love America. Right. I love the fact that it's big. I could drive to another state and it's like another country because the culture here is so crazy different. But the government is not our country. When people get pissed, you don't support our country? I support our country. I support our country to the point where I don't think our soldiers should be going to goddamn Iran or anywhere else because, Chiquita Banana or Mobil Oil wants to make a buck. Fuck that.
Right. But they're not told that's why they're going.
That's why the draft age is 18 and not 25. But I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah. I mean, the ones who go into the military, they know nothing of the U.S. history with these countries and dictatorships. They know. And they're actually trained to hate the other, whoever that other might be. In some cases, the Zapatistas.
Sure.
If anyone brown, it's, I hate, I've had people admit to me, I know what we did there was wrong, and it was just like for the people in black suits above, but I just hate Iraqi because they killed my friends.
Yeah, okay, they probably did kill your friends. You know who you should hate? You're going after the mailman, right? You should go after the guys at the top. It's John Bolton that needs to get hanged. It's Elliot Abrams that needs to be executed. Shot. I'm flat out saying shot. They need to be taken out and shot. We hung Saddam Hussein. Okay, for some of the shit him and his sons did, fair enough. We should have hung George W. Bush. We should have hung Dick Cheney. And I mean hung.
Oh, God.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that from the bottom of my little black heart because those motherfuckers have committed war crimes. Lying us into a war. And we do the same shit in Vietnam. In South America and Central America, we're going to turn that place into Vietnam within the next 5 years.
I'm really horrified because, for a while there was hope in Latin America with Lula and Dilma and Kirchner and Bachelet. And now there's this, and what happened in Ecuador seemed to be the beginning of the dominoes.
Right.
Now all these, somewhat, democratic governments are being replaced by really right-wing.
What pissed me off about Ecuador, though, what was really frustrating about Ecuador was that guy wasn't just out of nowhere. Right? Lenin Moreno was not like some dude. It wasn't like Bolsonaro running against Lula da Silva. It was like he was in the administration. He was in the Correa government. Right? He's like the number 2 guy. He's like the vice president. So when he ran, it looked logical that he would just carry on with what Correa was doing. And no, we're going to have a U.S. base in the Galapagos Islands, something that Correa put his foot down on. He kicked out the U.S., by the way. And then when they wanted to put a base in the Galapagos Islands, he's like, great, I'll get a base in Miami, and then you could put a base in Galapagos. How's that sound? And they didn't like him.
And now Korea is a criminal.
Yeah, so he gets labeled a criminal. Yep, it's the same thing with Manuel Zelaya in Honduras. We arrested him in his pajamas 2009. Thank you, Obama and Clinton. And for what? The guy was not even a socialist, but for the crime of raising the minimum wage. Because American companies that were having stuff manufactured down there didn't want to pay a higher minimum wage. So forget that. Gonna put that guy's a criminal.
Maybe that was the beginning of it. Right?
And so it's just on and on and on and on. And so now we got people saying, you need to go down there. Really? Send your kid. This is my pet. It's a petty thing to say, but I say it all the time. Great, send your kid to go. Send your kid to go. Send your kid to go to Iran. Well, I have family in the military. Then you should be howling at the fucking moon. And if you're not, you're a fucking idiot. Sorry.
That reminds me of that scene from the 911, the Michael Moore movie about 911.
Okay.
And he actually went to the, D.C. and asked all these politicians coming out, would you send your kid?
No, yeah, right.
You believe in Afghanistan? Would you send your kid? And none of them would answer him.
Right, because how do you answer that? This isn't the 40s anymore where Jimmy Stewart is signing up and Hank Greenberg is signing up and Audie Murphy is signing up. Like actual bona fide sports and movie stars are signing up to go fight a war. Right? This isn't that anymore. People start getting smart by Vietnam. What the fuck are we doing over there? I'm not going to sign up. We're not defending anything. World War II was like the last and probably only war that was like a justifiable defense. And I could probably tear that apart in an hour too. But the point is that Korea, no. Vietnam, no. All of our adventures in the Middle East and South America, no. It's all for American profit. So, but hey, listen, real quick, we're kind of coming to the end of the time. Is there anything here that you want to kind of get out there, promote? You got a book you're doing, or what are you doing?
I'm writing a book chapter, but probably mostly librarians will see it. I guess I promote the idea of looking critically at all information. We used to say, if it's in the library, it's okay. No, we have, Dulles, J.W.F. Dulles was someone who ran Hana Mining in Brazil.
Yep.
Somehow he was appointed to be history professor of Brazilian history.
Right.
And he taught misinformation until the age of 95.
Yep.
With no credentials, right?
Right.
So, and he still writes in, you still find him in encyclopedias citing the Cold War propaganda about Brazil. So if people want to know about these things, they need to actually read, books by people documenting the events, like We Cannot Remain Silent by James Green, A Mother's Cry, Tropical Truth by Caetano Veloso, which is what started me on this whole thing. It's a musician who was imprisoned in Brazil during the dictatorship. Mm-hmm. Just read and be skeptical, especially when the narrative is sort of condensed and reduced.
Yeah.
It's oversimplified.
Because
when I've looked into who writes these things, they're often people affiliated with the government or the military.
Not hard to do these days. All you have to do is, if you're watching MSNBC or whatever, just pull out your phone, Google the guy talking. And he's in the first three searches. She's in the first three searches. Oh, she happens to be the assistant vice president of marketing at Halliburton. Oh, they didn't say that on the thing. They just called her a consultant. Right? Just stuff like that. Or, so-and-so went to go work for the board of Baker. You're like, okay, all right, that's John Kelly left the Trump administration now.
Affiliated with Ned.
Right, yeah. Right, that's another OAS type bullshit operation. Well, listen, we could easily do another hour. We're at the end of the time. But I thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge and expertise with all of this. I was really glad to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much, Abe. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, hey, guys, I'm sorry?
I will talk to you again soon.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, guys, hey, listen, we're wrapping up. Again, patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. And like I said earlier, you could subscribe on iTunes and Spotify and everything else and get notifications when we drop a new show. And if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.